spring harvest in your living room at home. I'm so grateful for Spring Harvest, being able to get everything ready to put Spring Harvest out to everyone for free online. Thank you so much for doing that. And I'm really glad to be here. My name's Ruth Bancewicz. I'm the Church Engagement Director at the Faraday Institute for Science and Religion, and I'm going to speak to you today about science and Christianity opportunities to engage. So if you haven't already got it, you might want to hit pause, have a look back at the website and download the PDF of my slides. You won't desperately need them, but they will be helpful, and there's some very beautiful pictures in them and some helpful links for later. So I'm going to speak today about worshipping God with science, how we can do that. Most of us are not scientists, but we can be really excited bystanders and also encourage those in our lives who are scientists. I'm going to talk about some scientists or people of faith and how they make sense of that. I'm going to talk about how churches, so that includes everyone, whether they are a scientist or not, can engage with science well. And I'm going to talk about what some churches have been doing. So first of all, let's talk about worshipping God with science. So science is all about gathering evidence. If you can weigh something, if you can measure it, if you can observe it, then you're doing science. And the aim is to be able to come up with some general principle of how we can, what we know about the world from those experiments, and maybe even describe it, or if we can, we want to describe it using some kind of mathematical equation. Science is really creative. There's a lot of problem solving, trying to use resources well, and there's a lot of imagination, using our minds to understand our data and come up with a way of making sense of it. It can also be a bit intuitive, so we might, our minds might make some kind of leap. Oh, I think we should do this. And afterwards, if you unpick it, you can realise that probably actually it was based on this knowledge and that thing that someone told you in that experiment you did last week. You put it together and your mind sort of jumps over that and comes up with an idea for you. So those intuitive leaps are really helpful. Scientific knowledge is always provisional, so you might see a brown cow and say, well, cows are brown, but the minute you spot a white cow or a black cow, you know that you need to update your statement. It's also about reducing bias, so we can, for example, if I really like brown, I might be tempted to hold on to my brown cow idea and not go looking too far for any other kinds of cow, but my colleagues might say, hang on a minute, Ruth, I've just seen a beige cow or a brown cow or a black cow or whatever. So having our colleagues around us to review our work and have input into it is really helpful. In the end, we want to be getting nearer to the truth all the time, sometimes a step forward, sometimes back, but overall, our program of research should be showing us something that's helpful about the world that's true. So, for example, if I look at a coral reef, or if you've ever had the opportunity of swimming around one and seeing all those beautiful things on a relatively undamaged reef, there's so much that you can learn using science. So you can look at all the different species, the coral itself, the seaweed, and then the little shelly creatures and the crabs, and then all the fish and eels and what have you, and the different ways that they interact together. They might help each other, they might eat each other, they might do a bit of both, and science can tell you a lot about how that reef is operating. It can't tell you what it's worth, it can't tell you what we should do with it, so there are limits to science, but there's a lot you can learn that's very helpful. The other half of the jigsaw, if we've learned about what science is the learning about, thinking about, as Christians, what do we believe about creation? So I call this the doctrine of creation. First of all, we believe in one God, obviously, Trinity, triune God, who is the creator, who's the ruler, who's the sustainer, who keeps everything going. We believe that he made everything from nothing, all by himself, that we know from the Genesis account there was a lot of bringing order to things. We know that God's creation is good. We know that he has this ongoing, creating, sustaining power, that without him things would cease to exist and cease to keep being so wonderful and diverse. We also know that creation is a source of wisdom. The wisdom literature tells us that, the Psalms and Proverbs and other books. But we know that creation is not divine. It's not some kind of God in itself. It's not something to be worshipped. We also know, we learn from the Bible, that we are in God's image. We are his representatives. But that evil and suffering entered the world when we sinned. Something has gone wrong. But despite that, creation is still good. There are still some difficult things happening there, which I'll talk about later on. But creation essentially still remains good, and it will be redeemed in the end. We'll have a renewed and restored creation in the end. It will be even better. There'll be no decay and no dying and no nothing. Just wonderful things to enjoy in the end. So if you put our knowledge of what science is and our theology together, you could come up with some kind of theology of science. And there are some sort of basic things that we need to realise as Christians that help us to do science, to make sense of science. Some assumptions. Obviously, first of all, that everything is God's. It's all his. There's nothing to be afraid of there. All the things that he made are worth looking at. And I really don't like the idea of a natural, supernatural language, sort of the divide there that we put in there. It makes it sound as if there's these things that are natural that don't have anything to do with God, and then there's God's stuff. It's all his. So I tend not to use the word nature very much. Then there's the idea that God is rational, because we're made in his image. We can do rational stuff too. We don't always have to do rational things. That's not the only good way to be, but rationality is part of who we are. That's a good thing. And then there's the idea that science can complement our theology. So there's two sort of levels or ways of thinking, and there are several different ways to describe this. One would be, first of all, God has revealed his knowledge of himself and his purposes to us, to people, which has been recorded in the Bible, in his word. And then there's also the scientific knowledge of creation, and those two can work together. Or you could think of God as the primary cause, who is the source of everything. And then you could think of scientists who study the secondary causes, the sort of downstream mechanisms of how things work out. Or the very simplest way of thinking about this, and this is illustrated by those kettles on the slides, is in terms of mechanism and meaning. So if you watch a kettle boiling, you can see, a physicist could write an essay about what is happening to the water molecules, and then you can also think about, why am I boiling the kettle? Okay, it might be to satisfy my thirst, which is still something scientific, but it might be something more than that. It might be because I'm meeting up with someone I'm not thirsty at all, and having a cup of tea is symbolic certainly for British people, or many people around the world, different kinds of cups of tea and drinks, where we sit down, we share friendship, we catch up together. So we don't have to choose whether I'm a mechanism type of person or whether I'm a meaning kind of person. We can have those two ways of looking at the world, and they work very well together. Just because I'm having a cup of tea and it's meaningful between me and a friend doesn't mean that there's no underlying mechanism. That doesn't make any sense. Finally, the final assumption in our theology of science is that we can do science. We should be using scientific knowledge in good ways. That there are things that we ought to do with our knowledge and that we ought not to do, which is something we get from Christian faith. That we should be thinking about how we're doing things. For example, if you look at the smartphone that is probably very near you right now, you can use that in great ways. You can catch up with friends and family, and you can use that in very harmful ways. You can be rude to the people around you and ignore them while you're talking to other friends, rather than making space for both those things, people who are with you and people who are far away. So you can use, and that's quite a minor example. Well, it might be quite major in your household right now, but there are some much more extreme uses of technology where, for example, with with nuclear power, you can use it for something very helpful, for making energy, or you can use it for hurting a lot of people. Now science, that's one of the limits of science, it can't tell us what to do with our scientific knowledge. The sort of final sort of background question before we can think of what a theology of science is what about prayer? People ask this a lot, so I think it's worth breaking down what we think about when we think about prayer and miracles. So often there is some kind of secondary cause or mechanism involved in an answer to prayer. Whether you think it's miraculous or not, people have different definitions of miracles. But, for example, when the Israelites crossed the Red Sea, when they were escaping Egypt, the Bible reads, there was a wind that blew all night. And then the people were able to cross on dry land. So it's very clear what the mechanism is. Or you sometimes get other examples. For example, the resurrection that we celebrated last weekend, where we know dead people don't rise again. And we know that that was an incredible event where God did something very different to what he usually does. We're very grateful he sustains the world in regular ways. We can even study them using the tools of science and say there's a scientific law. When I drop something, it falls to the ground, in a certain way, and we can call it gravity and we can measure it. But if God wants to do something different for the sake of his interaction with us, to show us something about himself, then he can, of course he can. So whether we can understand the mechanism behind our answer to prayer or not, they're both answers to prayer. They're both actions of God. They further his causes in the world. They reveal his character and tell us something about his relationship with us. So I think that's important to get that down so that we're not, one of the things, people think scientists can't believe in prayer because they think you can't break scientific laws. And the other one, people think that it's only a miracle if you can't explain it scientifically. I think those are both false arguments. So, finally get to the theology of science itself. And I think there are two main reasons why we can study creation scientifically. First of all, because God values it. It's important to him, he loves it. It's very good. And the Bible is full of how creation is fruitful, it's purposeful, it's praising God. And one of the books at the end can help you to explore those passages about creation all the way through the Bible. God could have created any way he liked. There was a strand of Greek philosophy a long time ago where they thought they could sit in their armchairs and reason from some kind of first principles what the world should be like. But we know that we can't do that. God could have made however he wanted, so we have to go out there and explore it. Once we've got some idea of the mechanisms, we might make predictions then and test them with experiments. But that's not quite the same as sitting in our armchairs and sort of mathematically or philosophically trying to figure out without doing any experiments at all. And it shows our gratitude to God, and it honours him when we explore what he's made. The other reason we should study creation using science and encourage people who are doing that is that it's useful to us, of course. I already mentioned the wisdom literature, and they tell us how much wisdom we can learn from looking at the world, ways of living well by looking at the world around us. Also, the more we know about the world, the more we can tend and keep it. And, that's the command in Genesis. And obviously, this is the one that every scientist will mention in their grant proposals. It will help us to help people. Now, in reality, separating out helping people and helping the rest of creation, you can't put a sharp line between the two because everything's also interwoven. More generally, when we do science, like any kind of job that's difficult, it's something that shapes us and our relationship with God. It is a crucible for character formation. It's also a place where we can demonstrate what it's like to follow Jesus. As our patience is tried and tested, as we work with colleagues with grace, as we share, as we congratulate people who do better than us, all those things can demonstrate what it's like to follow Christ. Finally, and very close to my heart, it can fuel our worship. So, for example, In the picture, in the handout, I've got a picture of a karyotype. This is a snapshot of the DNA in a human body. So some human cells have been prepared in a certain way at a certain stage in their life cycle, and then someone's taken a photograph to show the chromosomes. These are chunks of coiled up DNA, very densely packed DNA. There are 46 of them in each of your cells, and you can, with Photoshop or something like that, arrange the chromosomes into this lovely order. They look a little bit like stripy socks. In fact, I got carried away, and I also made you a picture of the stripy socks in our household laid out like a karyotype. So if you're homeschooling, that might be a fun exercise you can do. But I look at this picture of these stripy bits of DNA and I'm filled with wonder. Our bodies are incredibly complex. We are fearfully and wonderfully made. And I just love to thank God for all the incredible things that He's given us. And the things that we can understand. We can treat people with medicine because we understand them. So we're kind of getting on now to more turning the lens the other way. We're using our Christian theology to look at the world. Having come up with a theology of science, we can come up with a theology of nature. I am using that word this time to save confusion, but we're looking at the world out there and saying, does Christian theology make sense of that, or what we see with our eyes and what science tells us about it? I don't think we can learn anything without, if you leave Christian theology aside and just go to nature, go to creation, or if you just think it's nature with nothing to do with God, I don't think there's much you're going to find out about God from there. It might fill you with wonder. You might see a lot of complexity and beauty. You might have a sense of purpose living in it, and ask, is there a mind behind it? You're not going to find Jesus. You're not going to find our God. But I think if you take Christian theology and use it as a lens, I've got a picture of lens there on the slide, and look through it at the world, does it bring things into focus? And I think it does. And I get this from the theologian Alistair McGrath. It makes sense of a lot of things. It makes sense of the order we see in the world. It makes sense of the fact that the world seems to have had a beginning. So the physicists tell us at the moment. We can see that very clearly the world is very fruitful. Even the parts that we have destroyed quite thoroughly are still pretty fruitful. And we can see that over time it has increased in complexity, which gives us a sense of purpose. So when I look at, I've got a picture here of a Scottish rainforest. It's not as big or impressive as rainforests in other places. The trees are small because it's a cold and windy place. And the trees are sort of little deciduous trees, but there's so much richness there in these very small patches of original rainforest that are left. They've been disturbed over the years. They're quite a patchwork places, but in this particular patch on the west coast of Scotland, there was so much lichen, huge numbers of different species of lichen and moss. The place on a sunny day in the summer was buzzing with insects. I could hear birds. And I could, in a sense, worship alongside all of the creatures and plants there. They're worshipping God by just being themselves, doing their thing. I can worship God more consciously by thanking Him for everything that's around me. Now, the question that often comes up, and certainly in the times we're living in now, unfortunately, is that was very nice and positive. It makes a lot of sense, but you're being so positive about everything that's happening in the world. What about the things that are difficult? What about the suffering we experience? So I won't shy away from that. I won't give you an in-depth answer because we have such a short time, and I've recommended several books at the end where you can go for more in-depth answers. But as I've already mentioned, suffering entered the world when people sinned. And creation has been spoiled in some way. Now, most of what happens that's bad to people is caused by humans. So if an earthquake happens, we sometimes say, well, that's an act of God or a natural disaster. But actually earthquakes, plate tectonics, the plates rubbing against each other in the earth, are what make the earth fertile. They bring the minerals up to the surface. Without them, our earth would be completely sterile. So in themselves, plate tectonics are very good, But when we are foolish and we build on plate tectonic boundaries, when we build buildings that are not stable, when we ignore or disrespect local knowledge, where people may have known that was a bad place to be, trying to make permanent dwellings, then very, very sadly, a lot of loss of life can happen. When we pay attention to our surroundings, when we build better buildings, it saves a lot of lives. So that's an example of human sin, selfishness, greed, causing a huge amount of harm. Also, for the scientists, there are quite a lot of confusing questions about, what God's good creation was originally like. And I won't go into that in much detail, but I'll just raise the point that we must let God be God and let his scripture speak to us, and not try and impose our own human, what we would like good creation to have been like, on scripture. There may have been pain in God's good creation. It keeps us alive. It stops us from munching on broken bones and hurting our mouths, for example. Pain is a very, very good guide for living life. And there's some questions like that which a scientist, especially a biologist, might ask about God's good creation, that certainly call into question some of our interpretations of scripture, which owe more to Milton's Paradise Lost sometimes than to scripture itself. But stepping away from those more controversial questions, what we can say very clearly is that we know that Jesus came and he lived and he died and rose again to life to redeem the whole of creation, everyone who follows him, and also the non-human creation. We know he knows what it feels like to suffer, to go through that. He's lived a human life. He was fully man. And we know that he'll come again, and that one day there will be no suffering. So anything we see that is good and beautiful in creation, as we go out and get our exercise every day and see the signs of spring, we can let that point us to the new heavens and the new earth. So what have I talked about so far? Science and faith. Christian faith is a great framework for doing science well. That science is a wonderful way to enjoy and benefit from the wonderful world that God has made. Science can enhance our faith. It can help us to worship God and learn more about him and live well. But that science has some kind of limit. It can't answer all our questions. It can't tell us what to do. So, for a few minutes, I want to tell you about some scientists or people of faith. I think science emerged from the fact that people are people, as I said. God has made us in his image and we are rational. So I think in a sense there's probably always been science to some extent, although people wouldn't have given it that name. People have also always had some kind of spiritual sense, or certainly most people at various points in their life will have some kind of spiritual sense. So it's a very natural thing to explore God's creation, aware that it's made by a God. And the early scientists, several hundred years ago, were all people of faith. That was the world they lived in, that was the God they believed in. And Christian theology itself contributed to the rise of science in the West. The idea there's a good God, he's made a good world, we can investigate it with our rational minds, we can expect to find regular, ordered mechanisms to things. Those assumptions are there. Whether people believe in the God that was behind those assumptions is another question, but that's the history, and it's not terribly controversial actually. And I'll just give you 3 examples of scientists who are people of faith. One is Johannes Kepler, who wrote beautiful poems and things and prayers in his scientific works. I'll read one of them out for you. Our worship is all the more deep, the more clearly we recognise the creation and all its goodness. Indeed, how many songs did David sing? He received the ideas for his songs from the admiring observation of the skies. So Kepler was an astronomer. He was one of the people who looked at the orbits of the planets, did a lot of foundational work there. But that work sprang from his faith in God. Then there's James Clerk Maxwell, who is a very well-known physicist, who wrote this prayer. Omnipotent God, who has created man in your image and has made him a living spirit so that he can seek and have power over your creatures. Teach us to study the work of your hands in such a way that we can subject the earth to our use and strengthen our reason in your service and receive your blessed word, so as to have faith in the one you have sent to give knowledge of salvation and the remission of our sins. He was certainly a scientist who was full of faith, and also a very excellent physicist. To bring things more up to date, I've got another astronomer, Christine Dunn, who's from Durham University, who's written this: "For me, the more we know about the vast, yet intricate and beautiful God we live in, the bigger and more awe-inspiring is the God who made it all." So if all you knew about science and faith, you would expect science to be packed full of Christians. And it is. I've got some figures in the handout here that show that there are lots and lots of people who believe in God, who attend religious services week to week in the UK, who are biologists and physicists. Now, those particular figures don't tell you what kind of God they believe in or which particular kind of religion they're affiliated to, but they do say that there is about 55% of biologists and physicists in the UK, about eight years ago, were believing in some kind of God, which is exciting for those of us who may have heard more negative things. That's a very exciting figure to see. Now, it is fewer than is in the regular population, so about 72% of the population believe in God, and about 55% of biologists and physicists that were surveyed in the UK believe in God. So there's quite a bit fewer, and there was also quite a bit fewer people attending religious services, there's something to grieve there. What's going on? There's still a lot of people of faith in the sciences, but not as many as there are in other walks of life. Why is that? Have we been putting off young people from studying science for some reason in our churches? Have we been putting off scientists who are interested in God by making them feel as if they have to choose between God and science or God and certain kinds of science? I think there's something there to make us sit up and think, well, how can we engage with the sciences in our churches in a way that doesn't put up barriers for people, but actually opens the door wide and says, you can be yourself, come and follow Jesus. So, I have just 6 ideas that I'll go over briefly about how the church can engage with science. First of all, we need to stay informed and equipped. Now, science may not be your main thing, so you may not want to read about it all the time, but at least you can know where to go. And the Faraday Institute has a new website coming along. We have one at the moment, but there'll be an even better one soon, where you can find out a lot about the engagement between science and religion, and science and Christianity in particular, on the churches section. And we'll also recommend other organisations where you can find out more. There are a number of us out there. And then second, one very easy thing you can do is revel in the wonders revealed by science. If you're quite a visual church, if you're using videos at the moment, or if in normal circumstances you would use projectors and things, there's so many wonderful free images. I have 2 here, one of which came from NASA, one of which came from Welcome Image Gallery, both of which give royalty-free images that you can use. You might want to tell stories, whether as part of your sung worship or sermons or prayers or whatever, about scientific discoveries, or maybe even things that people in your church have been doing themselves. So I'd start by setting the bar fairly low and doing some quick and easy things. Next, going a bit more in depth, you can help people to explore the areas of theology, to understand their own faith, looking at the Bible, looking at what we know about God. That can help us to interact with science better. Can we understand prayer? Can we understand how we should be caring for creation? What's the biblical principles behind that? What does it mean biblically to be made in the image of God? Or can we go deeper into the doctrine of creation? So we've got a firmer foundation when we then start looking at science. Or you can turn it around the other way and look at the areas of science that will inform our Christian thinking that we need to respond to. So we could look all about climate change and what's happening to the environment, and then think about how we respond to that as Christians. Or we could look into medical ethic, medical things that are happening, reproductive medicine, and think about how we can respond to that. Where do we think the boundaries should be? Maybe in use of technology and artificial intelligence, what's possible technically now? Do we know? And then responding to it as Christians. Or simply just finding out some wonderful things about the world, some of the kinds of things that I've been sharing you today that can inform what we know about the character and purposes of God. Next, going to another fairly easy one, we can encourage the scientists in our midst, or people who have careers the way they're using scientific knowledge, and also the young people who are studying science. Can we encourage the ones of them who are really interested in doing science, that science is a great job to be doing? Can we shift some of those statistics in a more positive direction? Next, there's things we can do. If you're an activist or your church is being keen on doing things that are practical, there's a lot we can do to look after people and also the non-human parts of creation. As I said, it's sometimes really difficult to separate the two. Can we think about unnecessary habitat destruction about the world? Can we speak out about that? Can we influence government policy about that? Can we support charities or do things ourselves that can help with that? Or if there are new technologies coming in with artificial intelligence, can we have a voice in the world about that? Can we inform people what's going on? Can we have a voice to the policymakers about things that we might not be comfortable with, or things that we really want to encourage because they're so useful, we think we really need them out there in the world, we want to be able to use them. Finally, and this is one of the things that churches will do first, which is to think about building bridges. So this is, thinking how can we start conversations with people who are not Christians or people in the communities around us, friends and family and colleagues, sharing this view that you don't have to choose between science and faith. Can we help them and enjoy discussing with them the big questions that science raises? So if you look at the night sky and you see this incredible, if you're in an area without much light pollution, incredible sort of Milky Way and all the stars and maybe the odd meteor shower going past you, what does that make you think about? Where do you go with that sense of awe and wonder? This is where a Christian goes. What do you think? Let's have a conversation about that. Or do you have a sense of meaningfulness or meaninglessness? Can we talk about that? And then there are all the issues and objections people will ask. How could a God let this happen? Surely you can't pray for a Christian. What does a miracle mean? All those kinds of things. Questions that come up, sort of more apologetic debates. There are a lot of people who do that very well, and we can join in with that. So I'm going to finish there. I'm going to leave you with 8 ideas on the handout about what churches have been doing. I think it's nice to be inspired by what other people have been doing and see what kind of projects they've been getting involved in. I don't think you have to do anything massive. In fact, starting with something massive probably isn't a great way because you're probably going to give up. Start with some little things and just trickle them into what you do bit by bit. Do a little bit here and there throughout the year with the different groups. Big idea would be to do something with buildings, or you could do a little thing and do a little exhibition of scientific images in your church. Talk about the awe and wonder. You could do a bit of hands-on science in some of your regular groups. There are great resources out there for those. You could do something in your Sunday service if you're the kind of church that uses liturgy. There's some wonderful liturgies out there. The Church of Scotland has just released one on their website. You can get outdoors and do things outdoors, which is very relevant at the moment. There are things for small group studies and also engaging with the scientists if there are any science parks around you. And then there's obviously the one that a lot of churches go to, which is to put on a talk or a lecture or a debate. So all of those slides most of them have links that you can click on. You can see blog posts, you can find resources. And I've also provided my email address, so if you have particular questions, do get in touch with me or go to the Faraday Churches page and find out more. So I hope you've enjoyed that. I hope you found it helpful. I hope you found it challenging in a good way. And I hope that you can go on now to include science in some of the things you're doing in church. We can be relevant to the outside world. The theme of Spring Harvest Home is Acts, the church unleashed on the world. And I think science is a big part of that. So let's go and do that now.